All right. Okay, so many of you saw a very short version of this week, but I promise that if you're here, there'll be more content and more chance to discuss, hopefully, a little bit more detail. And got some good feedback from Mike and Will and the doc, which is great. And so try to gear toward the end of the slides towards that. So maybe not the most exciting topic for Friday before the break, but it's still, I think, an important one. And whether or not you think we need something like this is really, I think, dependent on whether or not you agree on something like this statement. It's like many of the challenges that we face today in doing our jobs, not just people who use data every day, like me and other data scientists, but also other product managers and stuff. We're trying to make sense of like this huge mess of tables and rehash and having no idea where to start. Is that like, these are all sort of knowledge problems. Is we have all of this data, these data, as I was taught to say in grad school. And you know, it's very difficult for new people to know where to start, first of all, and it's even hard for me, who's somebody who's been doing this for 3 years, to find new things. So this plays out in like many different scenarios. If you're a product manager, you just kind of want the general idea of like, what do we record on, you know, this and that, this or that feature. And if you're a data scientist, you really want the details. How is this recorded? When is it recorded? Are there edge cases? I'm really interested in using it for this very specific case to measure this very specific thing. Will this probe do this for me? And if you're in leadership, what you might care about more are like the big level, high level metrics and how we measure them. So if you hear in some meeting about us measuring some new, you know, goal metric or setting a target on some new measurement, where do you go to find that out? Well, you probably go to a data scientist, but otherwise there's no self-service, I guess, corpus for you to go search through and find, you know, what are our important metrics. And then if you're an engineer, from time to time, you might be asked to work on some telemetry. If a new feature is being implemented, we usually add telemetry to it now as a matter of course. That's not a formalized thing we do, but we're just getting better at it. So you might want examples of other telemetry that exists for this feature. You might want to know what is already there and, you know, help just some guidance to help you sort through the code and find a template at least, so you don't have to start from scratch. So these are 4 use cases that a taxonomy could help with. I don't think a taxonomy is going to solve any one of these like 100%, but it could make it a lot better and it could save a substantial amount of time. I know that myself, I spent a lot of time on row 2 here. And I know, I should say that, you know, Sue and Corey, the other data scientists who've been helping out with this project, they agree. So it's like mostly tracking people down, engineers down, to understand how probes are implemented. And we could save a lot of time if we just had better documentation on this in a searchable way, in an organized way. So yeah, usually there's somebody out there, or there was at some point, who can answer these questions, but you know, our non-human sources of truth, they don't contain all these answers, and they're not sort of as comprehensive as they could be probably. And so what is our non-human source of truth today? It's the probe dictionaries, which are actually great. And when I say like we're making a taxonomy for telemetry, this is basically our de facto taxonomy for telemetry. It is a taxonomy. We don't call it that, but you can see there's fields here, many different dimensions, and it's all, you know, more or less really useful information. And it is generally accurate, actually. And it's not accurate 100% of the time, but in my experience, it's usually pretty accurate. The issue with this is that it's very much geared towards the technical side of things. And even from the technical side of things, it doesn't always contain the required information, but it's still great. And there's a version of this for Phoenix too, by the way, which I should have put up. So this is total URI count, which is something we as data scientists use all the time. It's a pretty important probe on desktop. And this one has a fairly good description of when it is recorded. So like when it is and is not recorded. So it says it's recorded after the session has been restored. It does not include background page requests and URIs from embedded pages and private browsing. So this is a situation where the description is actually pretty good. It may not have every case in it, but it does have these sort of gotchas that will bite you if you're trying to use these data. This is an example of, we've done pretty good, and it might be because this is a probe that we use a lot. But generally speaking, this description is usually not quite to that level. So yeah, this is all valuable information. But if you look back to these questions, how would you use the data dictionary if you're going to answer this, like if you're a director? Or how would you use it if you're going to answer this if you're a PM? I can't just go like, give me all of the video probes. I mean, I can search for video and that'll give you some of them, but it may not give you all of them. Like if I'm a new PM working on a feature like the protection report or something like that, there's definitely no list of protection report related telemetry out there. Or if I'm like looking for real general, what do you measure about privacy, for example, then the probe dictionary is not going to help you there. So this is not just a lack of documentation problem, then it's also like a knowledge organization problem. We don't have this extra layer of sort of ontological information on top of our existing technical information that groups things in logical and useful categories. We don't quite have that yet. So that's what we're trying to do here, is kind of like extend this technical information that we have with these more general categories. That's, I think, generally the approach we've taken so far. So again, really want your feedback on that. Do you think that's sufficient? So what we should probably think about a little bit before we dive into like what we're actually proposing here, like what do we want this to do? What would a good taxonomy do? And then like what would a bad taxonomy do? I think a good one would definitely help people understand and find out about what we measure. And that's potentially and often a separate issue from what is reported by the client, right? So if we have a probe that records how long a video was playing for, that may not be the thing that we care about. We don't care about whether any individual client played a video for 2 minutes. What we care about is something like number of videos played per client per day or something like that. So as a product manager, for example, maybe that's a metric you're interested in. Searching through the probe dictionary is not going to tell you how to calculate that or which probes you would use to calculate that broad level metric. So a good taxonomy would help people in their quest to find these actual metrics that they want to consume directly. Also, it would group measurements into these functional types that I'll talk about in a little bit. So people have essentially a shared mental model of these are the types of things we measure. Here are the different categories. Okay, I have a question now about how we measure this or that feature. I have these sets of categories in my head, and that helps me go find what I'm looking for. And then also, lastly, hopefully it will help guide implementation of new metrics. So again, from the engineering side, it'll help people discover precedent and prior work for them to build off of. So if the taxonomy does all these things, that's great. I mean, it's working as intended, and it's actually giving us value probably over and above the cost it would be for us to implement it. So this would be like the bad scenario. This is where, so these extra fields that I'll talk about in a second. They're going to have to be filled out, and they're going to have to be filled out as part of some process. And generally, people don't like filling out forms, and it's an annoyance. And the worst case would be that we create this extra work, bureaucracy, red tape, whatever, to generate a bunch of metadata that nobody uses. And that is really like the risk here. I think is just kind of wasted work and extra bureaucracy. And it would essentially, it could end up just being this collection of tags. You know how like every app has the ability to tag things like how many people actually use those tags and how many people search through and find those tags useful. Tagging is something that is ubiquitous, but often not helpful. So how can we avoid just being like tags on top of telemetry in a disorganized way? And also we don't want it to be too inflexible either. So the super flexible side would just be like, you can label the telemetry with anything you want and it just doesn't help. And the inflexible side is that we don't accommodate for all of the really diverse array of things that we measure with telemetry. And one thing we struggled with in this project a little bit is trying to create abstract categories or dimensions that have a fixed number of possible values that capture all of the telemetry that we record is really, really difficult. Just because anytime you say, okay, here's this one dimension that we're going to categorize all of our probes by, and we're just going to let it have these 5 possible fields and nothing else, that's really difficult. So we don't want the taxonomy to be too brittle or too specific, because then it's just not going to capture people's use cases, and that'll be, again, another case in which people don't use it because it's not useful and flexible enough. So there's a balance there that we have to strike. Okay, so given all of that preamble, these are the things that we think we should extend our current taxonomy by, essentially these 5 features, okay? And I'm gonna go through each one of these one by one, but roughly really quick, what we're saying is that for any given probe, so again, as you can imagine, this is like a layer of metadata that sits on top of what we already have in the probe dictionaries. We would have something like the product component. So this is the component, the technical component that the probe is instrumented in. So that, again, this is like still another engineering type technical piece. And then there's a product feature, which is, this is now a more human readable feature about these are the features or functions that this probe is intended to measure. And this is to help people like product managers and even data scientists find probes that are related to features, regardless of where they're instrumented or how they're instrumented. Then we have measurement behavior. This is that critical set of information that data scientists mostly, but others also sometimes need to know about when things are recorded, what triggers they're recording, and the sort of gotcha cases that I was talking about. And then we have 2 things. Metrics is a super overloaded term, and I don't know that this is the right word for these 2 things at the bottom here, to use the word metric, especially since Glean has a thing called metric that is recorded by the client, which is totally not what we're intending this to mean. So the problem is that I just can't come up, like derived metric is okay, we could do that. But so if you have suggestions here about a different word that would capture what I'm about to describe, that would be great, because I struggled a little bit with this and I didn't want to come up with some stilted term and throw it on here. So what we mean by metric in this case for this particular dimension on the taxonomy is like, what do we compute with this probe at the end of the day? Is that, you know, number of videos per client per day, video playtime per client per day, the 99th percentile of page load time per client or across all clients for per day or per week or whatever. So this is the thing that we usually use the probe for, and this should be, you know, I'll go into details in a second, but something that hopefully is extensible and can be changed over time. So, and just, yeah. And then sitting on top of metrics is this idea of metrics classes. And this is really supposed to give the highest level view into our data. What are the classes of things that we care about? You know, some probes are related to revenue measurement, some probes are related to performance, some probes are related to user behavior. This is intended to sort of create the highest level of organization here and help people create this mental model that I was talking about of different use cases for our telemetry. Okay, so let's get into it. I'm just going to go through each one of these with one slide and give examples. So product component, this one's relatively straightforward, although there may be some trickiness here. For desktop, we have Bugzilla components. And so right now we're kind of considering like, let's have people, when they fill out this taxonomy, just put the Bugzilla component that they originally filed the work for in their desktop work at least. If Bugzilla goes away, this could be an issue potentially. I don't know if it's planning to go away. It's not clear to me yet, but I know there's been discussions about it. But for now, it does a pretty good job of sort of aligning and helping people find the place where the thing is instrumented in. And we have links to the source code and stuff in the probe dictionary already today. But sometimes that's not super clear because the probe can appear in many different places in the source, right? So I think what we need is like, this is the place where the work is done. This is the component that is actually instrumented in where it is recorded. So I think that would be useful for people. Maybe, maybe not. This is, again, like I'm looking for feedback. In Phoenix, we don't have quite like the Bugzilla component sort of complement of things, but we do have a GitHub feature tag. So that's something that we could use. Again, if you have a better, more technical, formal definition for which Phoenix components exist out there, then that maybe we should use that. But like tentatively, these are two things that would basically just kind of copy over into the taxonomy. Okay, so that's product component, and then there's product features that we're also proposing. So this is like a non-technical list of features, and it's not just features. Actually, I would say it's also higher level. I could say properties, and that's not the right word either, but things like performance is not a feature, right? But it's still a useful thing that I think is a useful value that this dimension could take on to help people find stuff like that. I don't want to find all the performance probes, and I want to find all of the probes related to dev tools. That's actually a case where it's pretty easy today because they did a good job of labeling their stuff. But everything related to history, for example, would probably be a lot harder. Anything related to media. So again, this is the primary consumer here, I think, is product managers who maybe can write a little bit of SQL, but have no idea where to start about which probes exist. So this should really, I think, help product managers self-serve a little bit more and find probes related to the product that they're trying to improve or understand in terms of user behavior. So yeah, I think we would want to come up with like a relatively comprehensive list here, but still allow it to be extensible so that if you don't find what you're looking for here when they initially fill out the taxonomy, that you can still add another value if it's really not doing it for you. Okay, so measurement behavior. This is the really critical piece for data scientists. And in order to make sure that the probe descriptions that we have today become a little bit more detailed, we've kind of broken this down into 3 different things that should be included. And this is not this is not a fixed sort of set of things to like the previous product feature dimension. This is just sort of a free-form text thing, but constrained to contain information that we guide people to provide and that we know is valuable for people when they actually use the data. So there's 3 things we would want people to focus on here. Is the sort of the measurement interval. If it's accumulating data over a period of time, what is that period of time? Is it reset back to 0? When is it reset? Glean has standardized this to a bit, but all of our legacy telemetry, this varies actually quite a bit for a lot of our probes. and then if it's something that we check, like a Boolean value that we check whether it's true or false, how often do we check that? When do we check it? And the second piece is the trigger, that what causes it to be measured and what has to be true for it to be measured. Sometimes you have to meet these prerequisites, like it has to be at least 20 seconds after app startup before we record or something like that. So we really want this to be as clear as possible. It's like, yeah, when is the probe recorded? Anything special that has to be true for it to be recorded. And lastly, the gotchas and the edge cases, these can sometimes be really important. So we would want to have people be super clear, if there are types of web pages or web apps where a probe isn't recorded, to be clear about what those are. If there are certain states that the browser is in, like for example, if you're in private browsing mode, that things aren't recorded in. And just generally things that people who are using the data would want to know about in cases or in gaps where the probe isn't incremented. So we do a decent job of filling these things out today, but I think it would be a lot better if we just gave specific guidance about what things people should be including in their descriptions. And so this, creating this as a formal dimension, I think would help with that. Okay, so lastly, we have the metrics again. Metrics, find a better term for it, and metrics classes. So the metric here again is like what people are actually computing with the data that's the client is returning. And that generally takes the form of like thingies per other thingy. So thingy per unit of time, thingies per client per unit of time, etc. And here's an example here for the video probe that I was kind of talking about before. This is sort of how we would imagine this working. So that there is a metric name. So people say, okay, count of video plays per day per client. And this would be in the metrics class of feature usage. And then maybe we would also have an additional field here that people could put links to queries that show how to handle the probe or other pieces of information that would be helpful in actual usage of the data. So in terms of these metrics classes, we're kind of anteing on these 6 classes, but we're totally willing to say that maybe these are not the right ones, or we need to remove some or add some. I probably don't want them to be too big, but overall, I feel like these 6 things capture the important pieces of information that maybe a director might need to know, and also kind of categorize things into the highest level of bins, essentially. So we have search revenue metrics, or maybe it's just revenue metrics, but things that allow us to make money and measure that sort of stuff. User growth and driver metrics, so things that we use to keep track of whether or not we're getting more or less users. Feature usage metrics, so that would be video play time. Operational metrics, so this is like things like performance. Goal metrics, so things that we set, that teams might set actual goals by. So, for example, if I'm working on performance, maybe we have like a performance team and they want to make sure that page load time is always below some amount, so they can mark this as a goal metric. And this would allow, in theory, directors, for example, to go and see like, okay, how are each team measuring their goals and where are the things that we're measuring our success by? And then finally, we have this idea of guardrail metrics, things that we should keep within a certain range, and if we're not doing that, then we have an issue. A lot of these are inspired by Karloff's proposals. Actually, he wrote up a doc that contains some of these. So it's kind of like an amalgamation of Karloff's ideas and the existing taxonomy that Mark, for his data warehouse project, has been working on. So we're trying to use prior art here and not just make things up. But maybe we need to do a little bit more of that. So, thoughts on whether this is the right complement of high-level classification dimensions would be useful. But I think for most things that I've imagined, just kind of like scrolling through the probe dictionary, I can categorize into these 6 dimensions relatively easily. Okay, so here's an example of all of these extra things in actual implementation. So we have a page load MS2 probe. What does that do? Well, it measures page load time essentially. And so what we would have, and I didn't actually include product here, but we probably in the future, if we move towards one probe dictionary to rule them all, we might have multiple components multiple products contributing to a single probe dictionary. And in this case, this is measured on desktop Firefox. Here is the Bugzilla component. Here are the product features. So again, if you're looking for performance or DOM related probes, this should help you find this probe. Here's the measurement behavior. So the description of the measurement behavior, and then some gotchas, like 0 is recorded if the tab is closed before it's fully loaded. That's good to know. And we get this 10,000 value if the tab isn't successfully loaded but remains open, just sort of like eternally. And then finally, this is the metrics and the metric classes. So this is mainly an operational probe, right? But it could also be a guardrail metric. And we want to make sure that our average page load time per client does not go over some amount. So yeah, it's an example of something that are just an exercise, I guess, of filling out these new dimensions, one I might look at. Okay, so a really important piece of this, I'm not going to spend too much time on, but I want to acknowledge and discuss a little bit, is this actually defines a new instrumentation process. And again, like we want to avoid just seeming like red tape here. So how can we avoid being really annoying to engineers in particular who might have to fill this out when they're instrumenting a new probe? So we maybe want to consider combining and consolidating with the data steward review process. I'm not advocating that the data stewards like now do all this extra review. I'm just saying that maybe that if a data scientist is helping with a separate data scientist is helping guide the instrumentation, then they can help fill out potentially this part of the process. I think one thing that would be really helpful is if we had an experimenter like easy front end for people to fill this information out when they're instrumenting a new probe. That I think would make it much more enjoyable of a process and potentially much more manageable. Right now, the data steward review process is basically filling out a Google Doc and then copying and pasting the contents of that Google Doc into Mozilla. And I'm sure people don't appreciate that user experience that much. So we can maybe make that better, both for this data steward review process and this new process that we're proposing. And so the bonus here is that, potentially we provide more review and guidance from data science, and yeah, essentially tips on the instrumentation process and that sort of thing. We could offer that as kind of a bonus for going through this process. And then, again, just hopefully the feeling of you're giving back, right? Because if you use this taxonomy to find guidance on how to do instrumentation, then, hopefully you feel like you're giving back by filling it out as well. Again, like it'll be a fine line, but I think if we get all these four things, yeah, then it'll be hopefully better. Okay, so what does this look like in terms of implementation? I know like half the people on this call are been like thinking about this. I've been really vague about how we would implement this, and I think we're just going to need help from others. But I wanted to make sure that the idea is right before we start pulling people into a conversation about how we do this technically. But that said, I'm actually going to skip this slide. I think I've gone over this. Like, we want it to be easy to contribute to, easy to modify, and have powerful search and filtering capabilities. But in terms of implementation, there's kind of two approaches that I want to go over before I hand it over to Kimmy, because I know I'm going long. One is that we take these extra taxonomy fields, extra dimensions, and we basically just put them in the YAML files, the source code that already exists, that most of the dimensions and information that we pull from the probe dictionaries already exist in. And we make hopefully some tooling and the process around adding to these YAML files much easier than it is today. And then that is sort of the simplest solution, because in the probe dictionaries and the probe scraper that exists today just run on top of these extra dimensions, and we kind of just are basically adding to the machinery that we have today. This would be the simplest possible process. The only issue that I can imagine with this is that if we want the new taxonomy to be easily editable by anybody and easily sort of provide annotations, so that metrics field that I was talking about, for example, that might be something that really changes over time. The usage of a probe changes considerably depending on what we care about as a company, as an organization. So those things we would want to be modifiable relatively easily. And it may be that changing the YAML files is not like a smooth process that encourages this kind of sort of living documentation that we hope this taxonomy provides. But maybe it can. Technically, I don't feel qualified to speak on whether that's a possibility. So if that is too brittle of a process for maintaining this data, we could have a separate database that essentially contains this metadata and that is merged at some point with the information from the YAML files into the probe dictionaries. And this is like has a lot of complications here in terms of versioning and that sort of thing, but it would, at least in theory, allow us to have this intermediate storage that we can change easily. And potentially modify it more frequently, and they won't have to write the trains and all that stuff. So I think, Mike and William have already commented on the problem with this scenario, which is kind of the initial one that we had come up with. So we'll be working through this, and if other people have opinions on how this might work, that'd be great to hear. Oops, I did that in the wrong order. Okay, that's it. Really want to call out all the people who have been helped with this, Krupa especially. She was the one who has been sort of guiding us and making sure that this has all been kind of really part-time effort for me and everybody. So she has been pushing us along, which has been great. Sue, Corey, Jeff, Marissa, Mike, and William, they've all been helpful. And what we really need now is your opinions on this, because it has to be kind of an organizational effort. A lot of people could be using this, and we want as many people as possible to be using this. So opinions on this would be great. You can contact me directly. There's a link to the proposal in the first slide, and feel free to jump in there and give comments as well. Any venue works. So hopefully that was clear to people, and okay, I'm done.